Hungarians and Poles, an endless amount of people, were all permanently uprooted from centuries of independence and sovereignty and forced to the deserts of Central Asia due to their supposed criminal affiliations. At least 17.7% of all Muslim Tatars died as a direct result of the expulsions, and at least 23.7% of all Chechens in two of the worst genocides of the 20th century, of which no one has ever heard. Entire ethnic groups were consigned to ruin, falsely and universally accused of the crime of treason before they even had a chance to commit it. Excuse me. Joining these other supposedly criminal populations in exile, Volga German families, men, women, and children, were given official notices of their impending removal and the seizure of their property, and were often given less than 15 minutes to pack whatever few possessions and clothes they could into just one bag before being force-marched to the train convoys for deportation. The journeys by trains took weeks and often even months, often with no sanitation, heating, ventilation, or waste disposal, leaving women and children unprotected against the scorching summer days and the frozen nights of the Central Asian deserts. More than 151 train convoys from 19 stations were filled with ethnic German families, with as many as 50 or 60 people packed into one car at a time. Food and water were irregularly provided and often not provided at all, leading to massive starvation, hypothermia, and rampant disease. In one instance, according to one questionable source, 400 Volga German children and infants were found dead on one train convoy alone upon arrival in Siberia months later. After reaching the gulags and work camps in Central Asia after weeks of travel, already starving prisoners were effectively dumped in the wasteland and forced to perform hard labor. Volga German adults and women were conscripted into the so-called Trutarmee, meaning labor army, and housed in unheated shacks, where they were given exorbitant work quotas and deficient calorie rations. Children were segregated from their parents into holding quarters until they reached adulthood, and after an ideological re-education, whence they would be required to work just like their parents. The German language was banned as criminal, and all resistance or elements of independent German culture were punished, occasionally with execution. German civilians were under constant surveillance by Soviet guards and secret police officials, since they were now universally proscribed as a criminal minority. Excuse me. It is difficult to determine how many Volga German men, women, and children in total died as a result of the expulsions. Some unverified sources estimate that as many as 52% of all Volga Germans were either executed or starved to death on the trains, and 40% of those few who survived the transfer quickly died after reaching the work camps. However, more reliable sources calculate that at least 300,000 of the more than 1 million total ethnic Germans expelled from the USSR died, or about 30% of the entire German population of the Soviet Union. In his book, A Century of Genocide, historian Eric White cites that a minimum of 82% of all ethnic Germans were deported successfully, but the expulsions were only incomplete because of the interruption by the Nazi invasion, the subsequent shortage of manpower, the loss of control of the Volga region to the Nazis where most Germans lived, and the premature death of Joseph Stalin in 1953. Otherwise, as planned, the erosion and erasure of all the German heritage in the Soviet Union would have been total. Ultimately, a 200-year-old independent cultural community that had been loyal to the Russian state since the time of Catherine the Great had been almost completely obliterated. After Stalin's death in 1953 and the ascension of Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet Union liberalized its policies towards ethnic minorities and criminal populations, and the gulags and forced labor camps were closed entirely. Volga Germans were officially allowed to re-enter Soviet and Kazakh society, but regardless of this legal rhetoric, the supposedly dangerous Volga Germans were still subjected to increasing campaigns of forced assimilation, and German was no longer taught in schools. Germans were pressured to abandon their language and forfeit their heritage, learn to speak Kazakh and Russian, and assimilate into mainstream Soviet culture, thereby furthering the death of the old Volga German identity. Ethnic Germans were generally not even allowed to study at the University of Moscow, a basic prerequisite for a good education and career, until 1970. According to one source, less than 1% of Germans in the Kazakh Republic of the USSR had a college education. Germans were also only allowed to live in certain parts of the country due to a public perception of a German genetic criminality. After only a few generations, most Volga Germans had forgotten the language and culture of their ancestors. In response to this consistent ethnic discrimination and strong prevailing xenophobia, most Volga Germans emigrated en masse to West Germany, taking advantage of Germany's immigration law that allows persons of German blood to become citizens quickly and easily. But upon arrival, they often languished and waited in mass refugee camps for years. By the time of the USSR's collapse in 1989, there were 946,855 total ethnic Germans in independent Kazakhstan. But by 1999 alone, there were only 353,441. That's a loss of more than half to mass emigration in only 9 years. Most went to Germany, Austria, and Canada. Upon arrival in Germany, the Volga Germans assimilated finally, thereby declaring the total death of the last vestige of the Volga German culture that Stalin had forced into oblivion. Today, 2% of Kazakhstan is ethnically German, or about 300,000. There are roughly 600,000 Germans still living in Russia today. The few Germans who remain behind in Kazakhstan are caught, unfortunately, between a cultural disillusionment of assimilation versus emigration. Unsure of their national identity and unwelcome both in the very alien Muslim Kazakhstan and the metropolises of a very different Germany, the future of the Volga Germans is a source of concern. Efforts by human rights groups in Kazakhstan and abroad to create an autonomous region for the German minority have been consistently met with strict dismissal by Kazakhstan's president for life, Nursultan Nazarbayev, who is criticized in the West as a dictator with monopoly on all outlets of political influence. In reaction to this disillusionment, 33,000 Volga Germans petitioned to leave Kazakhstan for Germany in 2002 alone, hoping to feel more welcome in the land of their ancestors. But forced by Stalin in the middle of a great cultural uncertainty over where they belong and unable to speak the German language required to get a basic job in Germany, over 2,000 ethnic Germans have actually returned from Germany to the very poor Kazakhstan since. Various minority interest groups in Germany and Kazakhstan are struggling to represent German interests and promote German identity and language. The most prominent thereof is the German Kazakhstani Association of Entrepreneurs, or the Deutsch-Kasachstanische Association der Unternehmer, a bilingual business group promoting a rebirth of a separate German identity in cooperation with the Kazakh government. In Russia, on the other hand, Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has ironically worked to reverse the removal of Russia's Germans by subsidizing the return immigration of Volga German families to Russia. Hoping to alleviate the disastrous decline in the birth rate of Russia's Slavic population, the Russian government will spend the equivalent of 80 million euros by 2012 to encourage German resettlement and German language education. So far, of course, few Germans have answered their second invitation to Russia. In conclusion, the story of the vanquished Volga German community is one of atrocious human rights abuses, xenophobia, universalized racism, and exclusion on ethnic lines. The heritage of a distinct 200-year-old ethnic identity was virtually extinguished and considered criminal, despite the fact that they had not seen Germany for 2 centuries, had not even seen Germany's reunification, and had loyally served the Russian state since they were invited in the first place. Along with the tragic story of the Germans, of the Chechens, Tatars, Jews, Poles, and other countless victims of Stalin's totalitarianism, it is our responsibility as students and scholars to raise awareness of the destruction of an entire cultural community on ethnic lines. Thank you. Any questions? No? Yes? Well, the reason I choose to use that words in my research is that it's very difficult to generalize the entire experience of all ethnic Germans who were displaced or expelled. The number 15 million is used a lot, but for my research I find